The client that week wasn't a who, but a when. A paleophasic arc, salvaged from a dead time pocket after a gravitational blackout across the Gaia Beta lens. The ship's carcass looked like a fossil that had learned to dream. Its surfaces aged as light passed young hull, old hull that remembered being a tree. And at the fossil's heart, nested in a plank-field cradle, the Icarus particle trembled. An instability that whispered roots that did not exist. A stolen card from the universe's deck. Lyra had made a career out of thinking faster than auditors, but not faster than guilt. Her father, a diplomat, taught that accords are promises to future generations. Her mother, an engineer, taught that promises don't pay for parts. When the tactile console drew the impossible graph, a probability jet folding back like a comet, Lyra felt the old vertigo. That no is just the name we give, not yet. The alien arrived the way all of his kind did, without asking permission from reality. Tall, carapace refracting light into musical scales, eyes like liquid gyroscopes. Kethra, of the Chroma Vel, an unofficial ambassador of things that never have official ambassadors. He inclined his head, and the plates of his face produced a phrase perfumed with ozone. What you guard there, human, is a root burned from the cosmos memory. Some of us call that sin, others a path. And you? Lyra asked, keeping her hand too far and too near the containment field. I call it retrieval. Kethra showed a prismatic pendant, tuned with patterns Lyra knew from classified reports, signatures of ancient chunk dynasties, extinct after Hecate. There is a world we must reach, not past, not future, the denied. The question is, will you open the door your ancestors closed? The Cairo's rim throbbed with noises Lyra loved. Cranes breathing, drones arguing in tired binary, radio trash spilling Martian ballads. She could say no and sell the Ark to Saturn's museums, retire with a smaller shop and an aquarium of micromédicée. Or she could say yes and become a physics heretic in 15 systems. I don't touch Icarus without knowing who unleashed it, she said. The gods who signed the accord, Kethra answered, as if talking about rain. Not gods you worship. Gods in the sense that they can erase your species from a minute's sheet, and nobody asks why. Lyra's stomach dropped one level in the spine's elevator. Will they notice? Open it, and they will look. Don't, and they will keep pretending we don't exist. There was a time Lyra thought courage was the absence of fear. The rim taught that courage is choosing with fear on the table. She thumb-signed Kethra's silence contract, the glyphs singing on the visor like metal tuning to heat. You didn't need to insist. I already convinced myself. Kethra smiled the way his kind smiled, a resolving chord. They armed the containment cocoon, and time stood upright like a startled animal. The probability jet leapt from 0.2c to a value with no name. The Planck field tightened like a membrane. The universe blinked inside. Lyra saw a corridor open where there was no space, a scar that was a road, and heard voices that were neither echoes nor forecasts, but testimonies. We are those you forgot out of fear, said a voice like wind through wire, and we remember how to love and how to punish. Close it, Kethra said, but Lyra was already beyond command. The visor projected an impossible coordinate, a system called Halon, registered and erased in the same microcycle by the Confederation. Beside it, a note in ancient diplomatic hand, the calligraphy of her father. An entire childhood unfolded like a thermal nap. She touched a threshold kiss, not a full jump, and Icarus sang. The Rin shuddered, the station's time windows showing different versions of the same clock, workers coming and going in lines that crossed without touching. Your ancestors locked the door, the voice returned. You are the key, and every key is a crime. The Confederation alarm opened like a steel flower, inspector ships arriving from 12 angles, the Hecate sigil shining with the bad gloss of history. They came too fast, Kethra said, as if they already knew. Lyra cut the kiss, and still the taste remained copper, ozone, promise. I knew it wasn't just science. It's family. Inspectors docked, and a face Lyra knew appeared on Priority Channel. Aiko Sato, aunt, a diplomat tasked with putting out fires before anyone sees smoke. Lyra, dear, close this. You don't know who you're talking to. Lyra looked at Icarus, at Kethra, at her father's signature haunting the HUD. Maybe it's time someone talked back. Aiko serves a temporal dissolution, writ if executed. The Ark will be unborn, and with it any route to Helen. Lyra has 90 seconds to decide, obey, or break the accord and draw the god's gaze. Kethra steps forward, and the station answers with microtremors, the chroma vel, bend nearby space, the way heat bends a road. Ambassador Sato, your minutes call our grief contraband. Aiko doesn't blink. Your grief nearly broke 3 constellations. Inspectors prep cutting charges for the cocoon. Lyra opens a private channel to Aiko, the same frequency she used to send hydroponic garden voice notes as a teen. Father wrote Helen into the accord documents. I saw it. Why erase it? Heavy air conditioning silence takes the line. Because Helen is where we promised to stop being gods, Aiko says. Lyra's hands walk the panel like they have their own memories. She spins redundancies. Copies Icarus's signature to a cold buffer, primes a peel jump. Not teleportation, but stepping away from the world line, like walking along a mirror's edge. If I shut down, I lose the route. If you don't, we all lose ourselves, Aiko counters. Kethra tilts his face and drops the prismatic pendant onto the console. Inside, a holographic memory ignites. Chroma-vel children beneath a singing sky, building towers of light that rise until color becomes silence. The tower trembles. The sky cracks along accord lines, and the song loses an octave that never returns. Holland was our choir. You detuned it. The dissolution writ arms like a blade charging. The entire station hears the countdown. 60, 59, 58. Lyra speaks to Aiko without taking her eyes off Icarus. If I'm the key, I deserve to know the door. Who are the gods? Aiko answers with the kind of honesty born under fatal deadlines. Us. The word falls and opens a corridor more dangerous than any jump. Diplomats, engineers, strategists. When Hecate nearly tore the continuum, we made a council with too much power and named it Accord so it wouldn't sound like a throne. Aiko inhales, and Lyra hears a millennium's weight in a single breath. Holland is an experiment that worked, and for that very reason, we banned it. We were afraid of something greater than us steering the route. Greater than you, or more beautiful? Kethra asks. Aiko closes her eyes for a second. It feels like a century. Sometimes it is the same thing. 40, 39, 38. Lyra earns the peel. The station groans in ways not listed in the manual. Inspectors try to pin the field, but the mirror slips. The rim goes half out of itself. If I jump, you'll hunt me. If you jump with Icarus, there won't be a hunt. There will be liturgy, Aiko says. And Lyra hates and loves her aunt for words so sharp. Kethra lays a light, heavy hand on Lyra's shoulder. The courage you want isn't victory. It is clarity. Helen won't cure the world. It will cure your doubt. And the cost? Every choir costs voices. 20, 19, 18. Lyra opens a channel to inspectors, docs, anyone awake on the Cairo's rim. My name is Lyra Sato. I will disobey. She says enough to wound and too little to kill. Speaks of Helen as promise, of accords as shields turned weapons, of a particle that sings forgotten names. If the gods look, let them see something worthy. Aiko no longer tries to persuade. She sends an encrypted packet that opens like a data flower on Lyra's HUD. Inside, the official route to Helen, the route that was erased, and a digital hand note from her father. When the time is right, may the daughter are better than the father ever was right. Lyra swallows a whole universe fitting down her throat. 10, 9, 8. Lyra lashes the route to Icarus, like sealing a letter that should never be read. The rim vibrates. Chroma vel on the open channel emit a harmony that makes the walls weep condensation. Aunt, Lyra whispers. Go, Aiko answers, and the blade of dissolution begins to fall. 3, 2, 1. Lyra hits the full jump. The station folds inward. The blade cuts where Lyra was and finds only history. The Cairo's rim remains. Lyra goes with Kethra, Icarus, and a buried choir rising like dust on an old road. Lyra and Kethra emerge in Helen no stars. Only a white vastness, like the inside of a sustained note, where city shadows sing their own architecture. In the distance, colossal figures turn, as if something has finally called their attention. They looked back. They stood on what looked like a boulevard, sketched in negative, a city suggested by absence. Edges hummed into being where her eyes lingered, as if attention itself were mortar. Towers coalesced in pencil lines, then ink, then glass, singing their own load-bearing equations. Architecture via harmony, Lyra murmured, and the vastness agreed with a quick brightening, as if pleased to be named. Icarus spun quietly in its cradle, no longer a tremor, but a tuning fork. The HUD flooded with glyphs that weren't coordinates so much as chords progressions that, if played, would become streets. Voices braided into the air, not speaking language, but consequence. Each phrase a cause that hummed a future into place. Lyra recognized none of the words and all of the meaning. "We are those you forgot out of fear," the choir had said before. Here, fear seemed like a poorly chosen arrangement. "Why erase this?" Lyra asked, more to the space than to Kethra. The boulevard answered by resolving into a memory, a procession of Chromavel children carrying prism lanterns, human envoys in sober suits, instruments that looked like telescopes married to organs. Above, a vault of sky pulsing in polyrhythms that made the heart want to march and kneel at once. The image held, then fluttered, as if embarrassed to be seen. "Because we built a council to keep us alive," Kethra said, "and it learned to love the power of saying no." He touched the city with a fingertip, and a square blossomed, an agora of listening wells, amphitheaters bent for resonance rather than spectacle. Hallen conducts will. It makes the best version of us louder. Those who lead by scarcity heard that as treason. Static snapped across Lyra's combs. Aiko's voice arrived thin, stretched like light through distance. It had chosen a different geometry. Telemetry reacquired. "Your vector is Lyra. That place feeds on intention. Anchor yourself." The diplomat's tone was torn between warning and awe. She must have piggybacked on the burns Lyra left in the wake. There are no straight lines to denied worlds, but there are fingerprints. "I'm anchored." Lyra flexed her hands, checking the subtle tremor that always came in the moments between too much choice and not enough time. "Define feeds?" The ground beneath her replied with a low chord. Every question was a note, every answer a structure. The city wanted to be asked. "Hallen amplifies what is asked with conviction," Aiko said. "Desire is currency and weapon. It can harmonize a council or tune a species off the staff." Lyra could hear the years of briefings in that voice, the way policy hardens around a story you tell yourself to survive. "We banned it because it nearly made us honest." Kethra angled his head toward a distant colonnade where the air had thickened into silhouettes the size of gods. They turned slowly, their faces not faces, but scores, staffs, and measures etched into the suggestion of bone. "Those are not deities," he said. "They are adjudicators. Hallen keeps its own court. Ask the wrong thing, and it will give it, and the giving will end you." Lyra laughed once, short, ejecting tension. "Perfect. A place where the genie grants the wish exactly." She thought of her father's neat diplomatic hand, the way he'd written Hallen into history, just long enough to tell his daughter it existed. The ache was clean now, less wound than compass. Then we asked carefully. The boulevard shifted beneath the soles of her boots, aligning with her breath. She tried a small test. "Show me the first time humans and Chromavel agreed not to be enemies." The air brightened, and the hall unfolded a joint conservatory, half cathedral, half laboratory. The instruments were living, their reeds and strings growing into the hands that played them. A treaty drafted in resonance, not ink, clauses sung in call and response, terms verified when harmonics locked. Lyra's chest hurt with how right it felt. Then the scene rippled. A discordant thread slithered through the chords, souring them by degrees. Not a villain, but a fear, a vision of an empire remade without rulers, of borders sung into irrelevance. The hall dimmed. Somewhere, in distant rooms of authority, someone coined the phrase existential risk, and Hallen learned the taste of being forbidden. "I don't want a museum," Lyra said. "I want the route back." The city hesitated, as if that request had weight, and then a bridge reached toward the colossals. The score faces pivoted to regard the two small beings at the foot of the chord bridge. Attention fell like temperature. Aiko's voice rose again, now with other threads braided in jurists, engineers, singers. "Committee online. We can advise, not command. Whatever you ask there, remember, you are being listened to by something that remembers you better than you do." Lyra blinked. The council that called itself gods had come not to stop her, but to witness whether she would still deserve the name we. Kethra lifted the prismatic pendant. Its angles caught the almost light and spun it into a brief rainbow, the first color Hallen allowed since their arrival. "Ask for a chorus, not a throne," he whispered. Lyra nodded. The bridge hummed readiness. She stepped forward, and the adjudicators leaned down to hear a human-scale question. The score faces trembled, and measures unspooled around them like banners, not opposition analysis. The air filled with counterpoint, models of futures where the root returned. In some, choirs built cities that did not devour the poor. In others, zeal turned concord into cult, and law calcified around melody like plaque around a heart. Lyra saw herself in 100 versions: martyr, minister, mechanic. None felt like the point. "Propose safeguard," one adjudicator sang, the syllables arriving as a pattern of intervals that made her think of her mother's knuckles, oil dark at a workbench. Practical, precise. Lyra exhaled. "Require dissonance." She let the words hang, then pushed on. "Any opening must include formalized dissent. A choir cannot tune if it cannot argue. Build the key as a chord with the seventh unresolved. It will ache until care resolves it." Kethra made a low, approving tone, plates of his face sliding in a way that read as relief. The pendant warmed. Within it, the memory of Chromovel children flickered back, now with humans among them, hands on shared instruments that didn't quite agree yet. Beautiful in the way scaffolding is beautiful, when it promises a place for people. Aiko's committee murmured over the line, the mixed braid of minds catching Lyra's proposal and pulling it through legal teeth. "Dissonance clause," someone said. "Enforceable through multi-species ombuds." Another voice. "Require rotating anti-choir train to break consensus when it curdles." Aiko and the sunset. "Nothing forever without renewal by the living." The adjudicators sang back a question. That felt like a hand on the small of Lyra's back, steadying and stern. "Price." The city dimmed a shade. Things worth having always named their cost. Lyra glanced at Kethra, then at the bridge beneath her boots, which had the texture of sheet music worn thin by rehearsal. "Price is memory," she answered, "not erasure. We will carry the record of each opening and its harms. We will not discard the dissonances we create, and the first record will be mine." The white vastness took the measure of that vow. The score faces stilled. Then, from the far edges of the plain, a low swell began. It moved like tide, like breath learned by a sleeping giant. The city brightened along old seams, re-inhabiting itself with caution and delight. A corridor drew itself in the air, no longer a scar, but a healed wound that still knew the weather. The Hallen route wrote its first line back into the world. Icarus sang, not a scream of broken speed, but a clear tone that threaded every instrument in the hall of their arrival, every crane on the Cairo's rim, every careful throat on Aiko's committee. In distant docks, inspectors paused without knowing why, and felt briefly better than their job allowed. In a Chromovel nursery, a sleeping child turned toward the wall of light and smiled, because somewhere, something had remembered how to listen. "Status," Aiko said, professional even as her voice frayed with relief. "Root handshake complete, covenant scaffolding." "It's beautiful," she coughed, covering the unguarded word with a crisp cadence. "Proceed to codification step. Lawyers will be poets when the structure demands it." Lyra forgave the slip. The adjudicators lifted, colossal attention easing off like shade moving away. One leaned a fraction closer to Lyra, and she sensed not heard approval tinged with warning. Hallen would not parent them. It would join only if they remembered to be difficult with themselves. Good. Easy is the slope to thrones. Kethra clasped her forearm, a gesture the Chromovel had borrowed from humans and improved with the addition of a harmonic that made trust feel physical. "We did not pry the door," he said. "We reminded it how it used to open." Lyra smiled with more teeth than diplomacy allows. "And we left our fingerprints in the hinges." The corridor ahead flickered with invitations, routes not only to Hallen but along it, to places where other species had sung their own courts into being and then silenced them for fear. A map of denied futures turned into a task list. Lyra's HUD populated with requests, questions, pleas. It was louder than any alarm and kinder than any order. Aiko cleared her throat. "Before saving the galaxy, one administrative note." The committee's braid tightened, voices aligning around something heavy. The dissolution writ did not die when you jumped. Someone fired it anyway, at the Kairos rim. The blade cut where you were, and it found people. We contained it, but containment is not forgiveness. The council will assign blame. The council will seek a narrative. You just wrote one. Be ready to defend it. The temperature of Lyra's resolve dropped into steel. Holland had accepted their covenant, but the old gods, hers, still loved the power of a clean story. Then we go back, she said. With the root in the commons and the choir at our back, she looked at the adjudicators. One more ask. The score faces bent close, patient as mountains. If we present the covenant and are silenced, if the council refuses resonance, allow Hallen to testify, not as miracle, as record. The city thrummed, considering. Then the corridor pulsed once in assent conditional, demanding the same dissonance clause on any testimony. Fair. The corridor home opens, but not to the Kairos rim. It opens to a chamber beneath the council's own dais, where the dissolution engine hums, hungry and half-aimed at the shipyard that raised Lyra. Aiko's breath catches on the line. They move the blade. Icarus brightens to a warning tone. Lyra steps through anyway, carrying a covenant that might save her world, or prove exactly why it was afraid of being honest. Aiko's breath was a thin wire in Lyra's ear. Security grid live. They moved the blade off-site to mask authorship. If it fires, it erases a time slice at the Kairos rim equal to your departure window. In plain speak, friends would be cut from history where Lyra had stood, not dead unhappened. A mercy for the council, a cruelty for everyone who remembered. Kethra's carapace pulled a cord out of the room, tasting its design. This was tuned by fear, he said. Fear of being wrong in public. The pendant in his palm warmed, echoing Lyra's pulse. The covenant she carried, resonance with dissonance, thrummed like a seed wanting soil. Two figures waited beside the engine, a jurist with eyes like sleepless glass, and an engineer whose hands were calloused with dutiful harm. They were not villains so much as functions. The jurist spoke first, voice careful as a scalpel, unauthorized ingress to an adjudicative sanctum. Seizure protocols begin. The engineer checked the console without looking at Lyra. Containment fails if we stop. It will lash somewhere. Better here, controlled, than my home, Lyra said, and the chamber felt that word home and turned its head. The corridor behind her shaded, as if listening through a curtain. She stepped closer to the engine, aware of the hair-thin boundary between prevention and plea. You moved the blade to hide the hand. I brought a light. The jurist's mouth tightened. Lights are for ceremonies. This is plumbing. Aiko's voice braided in, calm with a thread of iron. Counselor Neves, Engineer Parwan, you are on record. Do not mistake secrecy for safety. The Covenant carrier is present and will read into the archive. Lyra didn't raise the Covenant like a banner. She loosened it into the room like a scent. Words would be too slow. Holland's acceptance, a clause of dissonance, the promise that any opening would include opposition, that nothing holy could be sung without a seventh aching toward responsibility, all of it unfolded as harmony. The dissolution engine faltered. Machines cannot be convinced, but they can be retuned. Parwan's hands paused. For an instant, duty wavered, and a person looked out through procedure. If we don't cut, the contagion spreads. Lyra recognized the prayer that hides inside jargon. What contagion? Hope that does not report to us. Kethra moved like patience, poured into muscle. He touched the far rail and sang a single note the Chromavel kept for funerals they refused to accept. The consoles dimmed, not broken but ashamed. Hope has never filled out your forms, he said gently. It arrives with or without your permission. The jurist recalibrated the conversation with a gesture, motioned to dismiss the covenant on grounds of myth. Aiko answered before Lyra could, voice flanked by other voices. The committee still with her. Objection. Adjudicators of Hallen recognized standing and returned a public route under terms. Denying receipt is an act of narrative fraud. The chamber did not care for rhetoric. It cared for tuning. Lyra stepped to the engine and felt its frequencies crawl up her bones, seeking purchase to cut. You can fire this, she said to Parwan, eyes on the knives. It will make clean paperwork. And then you will dream of a station that almost had a future, and wake with bloodless hands that still feel dirty. She let the covenant hum in the hollow of the machine. Or you can help me install dissonance where obedience has been. Parwan's throat worked. If I step away, the lash could take the nursery ring. A different kind of fear, the right kind. Lyra nodded. Then we build a sink. Not a wall, a place for the force to resolve, without erasing the living. Give me manual. Give Kethra the harmonic bus. The engineer blinked, surprised at the offer of complicity. The jurist started to object. Aiko cut cleanly. Proceed. I assume liability on record. Hands moved. The room grew warmer with human friction. Sleeves sliding, skin on metal, the small, unheroic sounds of work that saves worlds. Kethra split his voice into two tones, one for the engine, one for the room, reminding both that they were being watched by a standard higher than secrecy. Parwan fed Lyra a diagnostic tree and the quiet apology of someone who had done harm because the form required it. If we reverse the phase here, he said, the blade will seek unresolved chords to eat. Good, Lyra said. We will give it an argument it cannot finish. The jurist hovered, hands useless without a vote to count. This is irregular. Lyra smiled with all the warmth she could spare. So is conscience. She slid the last patch into place, and the engine shuddered, the pedals unclenched a degree. The hungry heart found something other than bodies to unmake. The Covenant's built-in seventh, the eighth that insisted every opening carry its counter-voice. It began to feed on disagreement. It could eat that forever without choking anyone. Aiko exhaled, and the small noise felt like a room learning how to breathe again. Telemetry shows the Cairo's rim stable, she said, history intact. The blade's appetite redirected into the Covenant's unresolved clause. There will be debates. The jurist winced, as if the word were a bruise. And accountability. Aiko allowed herself a single unguarded syllable. Yes. The chamber lights shifted toward a softer spectrum. Somewhere above, beyond the dais, an assembly shuffled its feet over an agenda that had just grown teeth. Parwan stepped back, staring at his hands as if expecting them to be different. I thought we were saving everyone from a beautiful mistake, he said. Maybe we were saving ourselves from being necessary. Kethra offered him the pendant. Hold this. The engineer hesitated, then took it. Children sang flickers of memory in his palm, alien and human and ambiguous in all the ways the future is. He wept one quiet tear, which is how a lot of revolutions begin. Lyra checked Icarus's cradle. The particle had settled into a tone that matched the room, no longer trying to leave or arrive, content to witness. We need to go up, she said. The story being written about us does not include us yet. Aiko's route lit in the HUD, a clean thread through a maze that had been designed to exclude truth, unless escorted. Elevator 3. 2 guards. 1 camera that wants to be a window. Lyra laughed, despite everything. Let's teach it. They walked toward the lift. The petitioners of the old order arranged themselves in Lyra's future. Statements, censure, the honeyed knives of polite ruin. She thought of her father's note, for better than he ever was right, and felt the steadying weight of a world that had asked for a chorus instead of a throne. The doors slid open. The elevator sang a neutral pitch, and then when Lyra stepped in, slipped a half-step brighter, as if glad to be of use. Aiko stood at the floor microphone, shoulders squared in the posture of someone holding a river against a gate. Motion to admit new evidence, she said, and the room tried not to sigh. The chair-a-person with the steady eyes of a pilot and the exhausted mouth of a parent nodded. Admit. Lyra did not wait to be called. She stepped into the circle reserved for the public, which was empty as a habit. The camera that wanted to be a window pivoted toward her, curious. You moved a blade, she said. No preface, no apology. You aimed it at where I live. Then you pretended the blade was a process and not a choice. I brought you the truth you were afraid to let in. Holland returned the root to us with a covenant that includes its own opposition. We have a way to be powerful without pretending to be gods. A rustle, the sound a field makes when wind reconsiders. The chair lifted a hand. We have heard of Holland, they said carefully. We have heard that it is a story. Lyra nodded, generous. It is. All law is a story that threatens to be untrue. This one sings. She did not hold up Icarus. She did not play spectacle against procedure. She read the covenant into the record with the cadence of an engineer explaining a fix, terms, tests, the dissonance clause that forbade unanimity as proof of rightness. Kethra added the chroma-vel harmonics that made the terms audible as architecture. Parwan authenticated what mattered to the fearful logs, metrics, chain of custody. Aiko threaded it all through with the rigor of a diplomat who knew how to keep poetry from being arrested. Objections came in predictable flavors. A delegate from a frontier consortium worried about exploitation. Another, from a pious bloc, called Helen a temptation packaged as science. A third accused Lyra of staging calamity to accrue influence. She let them speak. The covenant required dissonance. Here it was. When it was her turn again, she chose small truths over grand rebukes. To the consortium, scarcity is real. This route doesn't abolish it. It teaches us to argue honestly about who pays for abundance. To the pious, reverence is safest when it has teeth. Helen is not a god. It is a mirror that refuses to flatter. To the accusation, I did not move the blade. Your own did. I redirected it into a clause that will keep you honest if you let it. If you don't, it will keep you busy. Laughter, the dangerous kind that loosens a room's posture. The chair glanced toward a side bench where senior counselors conferred, calculating the risk of being part of a moment versus the risk of being seen to stand in its way. Aiko inclined her head a millimeter. Lyra felt the room tip, not into approval, but into attention unbribed by fear. The chair spoke. Provisional recognition of the Helen route under covenant. Conditions. The dissonance clause will be supervised by a rotating body drawn by lot from species membership, with refusal to serve penalized by boredom. A ripple of surprise, and the covenant will sunset unless renewed by recorded dissent as well as consent. Good compromise is a machine that does not fit in anyone's pocket. It could have ended there, briefly noble, before the grinding began. But the chamber had been built for performances, and sometimes a performance wakes the building. The camera that wanted to be a window brightened, and the far wall, the one that usually hosted decorative graphs, became glass. Not metaphor, transparent. Beyond it, the city that had been planned without windows remembered a sky. Helen did not arrive as miracle. It arrived as record. The adjudicator's approval conditional dissonant etched itself into the wall as notation, not prophecy. Minutes. The chamber could ignore a myth. It could not safely misfile proceedings that the room itself had chosen to witness. Someone hissed, improper, already drafting a complaint on the inside of their teeth. The chair smiled with a tiredness that read as wisdom. Improper is how the living keeps the dead from winning. They banged the gavel. Recognition passed. Publish the covenant and its arguments. Suspend dissolution engines, pending audit. Convene the rotating anti-choir. Relief came like a bruise being pressed and found tolerable. It was not triumph. It was the permission to work. Delegates began the practical shuffle of committees, forming in real time, predatory and hopeful in equal measure. Parwan sat down hard on the nearest bench and laughed once, a bark that startled him. Kethra tilted his head, listening to a harmony that had not been possible when the hour began. Aiko reached Lyra at the edge of the circle. Up close, the lines at her eyes were not fatigue, but maps of where she had refused to be less brave than her job allowed. You did not ask for amnesty, she said. Lyra shook her head. If we codify grace only when it serves us, it will fail when it matters. Aiko's mouth softened. You sound like your father when he was still making promises he hadn't learned how to keep. The floor throbbed softly, a building satisfied with a repair. Lyra looked up at the new window, at a sky that hadn't been meant for this room, and thought of the Cairo's rim. The engine had been redirected, but scars would need tending. Apologies would need writing that did not hide behind passive voice. Work, the kind that makes a life. Requests flowed into her HUD, like rain into a thirsty field. Small stations asking how to install the covenant's clause. A minor syndicate offering to host an anti-choir. A school on Europa requesting a lesson plan that taught disagreement as a civic art. She accepted what she could, deflected what needed expertise she didn't have, and sent the rest to a queue, labeled not mine alone. Kethra leaned close. Helen opened more than a route. It opened a habit. Lyra nodded, sudden warmth in her chest that was not victory, but velocity. Let's build around it before someone sells it. They stepped away from the circle, into a corridor that smelled faintly of ozone and new rules. Behind them, the chamber buzzed like a hive, relearning a better dance. Ahead, the lift waited, and above it, somewhere not far enough away, the shipyard that had taught Lyra what it meant to choose with fear on the table. She touched the edge of Icarus's cradle, and the particle answered with a tone that felt like a kept promise. And she and Kethra started back toward the work that stories make possible when they are sung instead of sworn. Messages chased her. Some were congratulations, written in the careful script of people who hadn't been allowed to mean it before. Others were knives wrapped in protocol, offering inquiries, reviews, a tasteful dismantling of her career. Aiko filtered the worst into a quarantine that looked like a calendar invite. Focus, her aunt said. The first asks matter. They'll define the habit. Kethra veered toward a railing and watched the ebb below with the concentration of a diver reading currents. We must choose where the cord lands first, he said. A place with enough need to prove the covenant is a tool, not a shrine. Lyra's HUD pulsed a request tagged urgent. The Cairo's rim, reporting a fracture in the nursery ring's thermal loops. A mundane wound that would kill quietly if ignored. Beautiful. Awful. Exactly right. Home, then, Lyra said, and the word made the mezzanine warmer. Parwan, still stunned into honesty, held out the prismatic pendant as if asking permission to keep believing. I can get you into the transit spine without the press, he offered. I'm very good at building doors that don't look like doors. Lyra nodded thanks. Stay where people will ask you hard questions. Answer them. They took a service stair that smelled like ionized dust and new policy. Along the way, the building kept remembering it had a sky. In a records alcove, a clerk stared in shy delight at sunlight she had only ever seen on breaks. In a storage bay, someone had started a plant under the glass and named it after a friend who had once argued them out of a bad vote. The covenant wasn't a miracle. It was a permission slip for the ordinary to matter on purpose. The transit spine's hum was a softer cousin to Icarus's. Trams slid along beams like notes on a staff. Lyra keyed a route that had not existed yesterday and watched the console accept it with the hesitant relief of a system that wanted to be better than it had been taught. We're going to arrive loud, she said. The rim deserves warning. Aiko sent a burst ping ahead, concise and not quite formal. Returning with help, not alone, not a hero. As they accelerated, Kethra's gaze unfocused in the way it did when he let his species' other senses unfurl. The Chromavel have a word, he said, then paused, choosing the right translation for the courage to tune in public. It means to be wrong where others can hear. And keep singing. Your people may want it. Lyra thought of the anti-choir the council had just authorized, a rotating duty to interrupt consensus before it calcified. She smiled. We'll call it rehearsal, and pretend not to be scared. The Cairo's rim rose into view like a scar that refused to scab, stubbornly useful. Emergency teams in orange rigs were clustered along the nursery ring, heat blooms pulsing in unhealthy arrhythmia. Lyra felt the old, simple fear, the one that had nothing to do with councils or covenants. Small bodies asleep under failing systems. The tram latched with a gentle clang. The doors opened onto the familiar breath of coolant and crane hum, and tired jokes wearing thin. Hands reached, not for her, but for the gear she brought, and the promise that the work would be shared. The station manager, Argus Vale, had the look of a person who led by asking more questions than he answered. You back with trouble, or its cure? He asked, and didn't wait for an answer, because the loop screamed for attention. Kids wing first. They moved as if they had rehearsed together for years. Aiko coordinated from the shadow of a bulkhead, voice splitting into the committee and the crew without losing patience in either. Kethra tuned the ring's sympathetic vibrations until the heat had somewhere to go that wasn't lungs. Parwan found the invisibly obvious place where a cost-saving park was failing exactly on schedule. Lyra crawled into a maintenance throat, shoulders scraping paint, forearms singing with static, and listened to what the station had been trying to say without words. Someone overrode the tolerances to meet an audit, she said into her sleeve. No malice. Just a spreadsheet that forgot kids wake up from naps. Argus swore with quiet tenderness. I'll print that on a plaque and bolt it to the administrator's office. Lyra smiled, despite the heat. Print this instead. We don't starve redundancies to feed optics. They installed a dissonance sink in the loop, a trivial cousin of the blade's redirect, a place for runaway heat to argue itself into stillness without melting cribs. It was not elegant. It would hold. Kethra sang low to the structure as it took the load, the kind of note that made stubborn things consider compromise. In the nursery, the air got less mean. Monitors calmed. A baby hiccuped, indignant at the world's delay in being gentle. The covenant glowed in Lyra's HUD, not as symbol, but as checklist. Publish the fix, publish the mistake, record the dissent that made the fix possible. Argus signed his name to the part where the station had flattered a budget. Lyra added hers, where she had left a gap a clever saboteur could have used if today had been crueler. Aiko appended the policy that would make their shame useful. Audit metrics now required to measure lives improved, not just costs reduced. It was boring. It was beautiful. When the loops settled into a rhythm, they felt like sleep without worry. The crew leaned back in the way people do when a crisis stops demanding urgent grace. Argus looked at Lyra and Kethra as if trying to fit them into a story that wouldn't break under weight. "You could have gone anywhere first," he said. Lyra wiped a smear of char from her jaw. "We did," the room laughed, grateful for the lie's truth. News moved through the rim, faster than rail. Dock workers who had voted for different futures last cycle passed each other wrenches and unlearned a grievance. A food stall changed its menu board to add a dish called Seventh, spiced a little too hot on purpose. The Covenant had not healed anything. It had given everyone a language to be difficult together without breaking. The station sounded like rehearsal. It sounded like care. In a quiet pocket between alarms, she found the window that looked not at stars, but at the docks where she had learned to cut and mend. A memory swam up without asking permission, her father teaching her the difference between a compromise and a surrender. Her mother showing her that a graceful fix tells the next person what it did, and why. She let herself miss them in a clean line, then filed the ache under things to honor by doing. Aiko joined her with 2 cups that steamed like apologies. "There will be elections," she said, without dread. "The Covenant changes where blame and credit stick. Some will try to throw both at you." Lyra took the cup. It tasted like a truce between bitter and sweet. "If the story says I did this alone, it will eat itself. Help me make boring heroes famous." Kethra arrived with Argus in tow and a handful of kids who had escaped naps with the righteous. Stealth of small mammals. The children stared at the alien's carapace as if it were a toy they could learn. Kethra lowered himself to their height and let his plates shift into a harmony that translated as "I see you, and you are not furniture." One child, fearless in the way new people are, touched the edge of a plate and laughed at the gentle vibration. "It sings," she said solemnly. "It listens," Kethra answered. Parwan hovered, skirting the edge of leaving or staying. "I have resignations to write," he said, meaning confessions. Lyra nodded toward a console. "Start with a how-to. Tools people can use to refuse the next blade without making a bigger one." He blinked, then smiled like an engineer whose problem had become interesting. "Documentation as penance." "I can live with that." Requests kept arriving. A minor syndicate wanted training for the rotating anti-choir. A university asked for a curriculum that taught dissent as civic maintenance. A frontier clinic needed a Covenant-compliant way to ration without lying. Aiko parceled them like someone serving stew to a line that would not end, making sure the ladle went deeper each time. "You can sleep," she told Lyra. "We are many, if we remember to be." The station dimmed to its night shift palette. Lines on the floor glowed the color of patient moss. Lyra let herself sit, not because the work was finished, but because it would not be ruined by her resting. Icarus's cradle kept time with the rim's heartbeats, a metronome that refused to be grand. Outside, tugs danced with cargo, like couples who had been married long enough to argue kindly. Argus leaned on the rail, looking like a man who had learned to measure days by how many names he could keep safe in his head. "They'll come for you," he said, not as warning, but as weather report. Lyra shrugged, counting air intakes for the pleasure of their reliability. "Then let them find me at work. If they want a throne to push me off, they'll have to build it themselves." Kethra watched the kids drift toward sleep, their bodies trusting the room because the room had earned it. "Your Covenant is not ours alone," he murmured. "Others will want it and warp it and call it theirs." Lyra nodded. "Good. If it can't survive being used by strangers, it was never worth the argument." Aiko made a satisfied sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so tired. "You sound like policy." "I'm so proud and so sorry." A chime cut through the quiet, soft, urgent, a call taught to speak without panic. A console bloomed a message with the signature of a station Lyra had never visited, a ragged ring somewhere past respectable maps. Their request was not dramatic. They needed a way to keep a quarantine honest without turning it into a prison. In the background of the message, A nurse rubbed her eyes and kept her voice kind. Lyra stood. The exhaustion in her bones felt like wages she was willing to earn again. She glanced at the window that wasn't, and thought of the council chamber, remembering a sky. Systems could learn. People could practice. The route was not a road. It was a habit. We go, she said, to no one and everyone. We teach. We learn. We leave our fingerprints on the hinges. The rim answered with the comfortable creak of a structure that intended to last. The tram warmed the rails. The children slept. The Covenant's seventh kept aching productively, a reminder built into the tool that nothing finished should be trusted until it has argued itself sore. Lyra touched the edge of Icarus's cradle and felt it answer, not with glory, but with agreement. Then the crew gathered what they needed, and the station let them go without ceremony, because it trusted they would come back, and because there was work, and the work was the point. Docking was a handshake instead of a seizure. A voice came over the local channel, dry with fatigue, but trained to be kind. Port looming to inbound. We are contagious only with need and bureaucracy. Welcome if you come to help. Welcome if you come to listen. Unwelcome if you come to prove a point. Aiko smiled into her mic without pressing transmit. Even diplomats respected a good boundary. Inbound confirms. Help, listen, no points. The quarantine was for a pathogen that liked to ride on skin, like a rumor mostly gentle, briefly dangerous when crowded, most dangerous when Shane made people lie about symptoms. Lyra read the intake notes. The station had carved corridors into one-way loops, set up sunlight lamps whose spectrum had been tuned by someone who believed in mornings, and organized food delivery so no one had to choose between honesty and hunger. They were missing something small and structural, some way to keep the system honest without turning it into a trap. They walked into the intake hall, where a nurse named Sarao ran triage like a conductor who refused to condescend to the woodwinds. Sarao's mask was painted with a smile that admitted it was paint. "You're the Covenant people," they said, with the tone of someone trying out a new tool. "We have good bones here and bad habits. The first we can keep. The second we need to starve without starving anyone." Kethra listened with his plates, which could hear the distance between what people said and what they meant. "Your corridors sing prevention," he said. "Your forms hum punishment." Sarao sighed. "A form's only as good as the fear behind it." Lyra nodded. "Then let's build a form that's afraid of the right thing." They set up a table that was not a desk, under a skylight that had been painted to remember a sky. Aiko drafted a micro-covenant tailored to a pathogen and a station with a sense of humor, self-report without confession, disclosure without debt, isolation as a collective act with a timer that anyone could check and argue. The dissonance clause lived at its center. Explicit and unashamed, no decision about movement could be made without a dissenting signer who had eaten in the last 6 hours and slept in the last 8. Sarao stared, then laughed once. "You make empathy into paperwork. We make paperwork honest about what it's for," Aiko said. Parwan, who had turned penance into practice, sketched a queue system whose failure modes were boring instead of cruel. "If this jams, it jams in favor of caution and lunch," he said, color-coding nodes with the concentration of a person redeeming a trade. Argus, dialed in from the rim to consult on heat loop stubbornness, suggested a traffic pattern that kept dignity from being collateral. Lyra watched the room tune itself and felt a familiar, ugly joy, the way a system admits it wants to be better when given an excuse. The first test was an aunt who had been caring for 3 kids not hers, and a cough that sounded like a curtain, asking to be washed. The old forms would have made her admit fault or fake a name. The new ones asked her to map the threads of care she held, and paid a neighbor to take 1 thread for a day, and gave her a room with sunlight she didn't have to earn. "This feels like cheating," she said, suspicious with relief. "It is," Lyra said. "We are cheating the pathogen out of shame." Kethra set up a listening wall where people could argue with the rules out loud, and the wall would answer by showing what the rule thought it was doing. Children immediately flocked to it and invented an excellent game of making the wall scold itself. Sarao let them, because nothing clarifies a policy like watching it embarrass itself in front of an audience that refuses to be polite. Word traveled faster than pathogens when it wasn't handcuffed by pride. A crew from a cargo spindle asked to copy the micro-covenant. A nun who ran a kitchen rewrote the meal schedule, so anyone in isolation ate better than anyone out of it to remove the incentive to lie. A small-time smuggler offered to route contraband through official channels if someone would make the official channels less allergic to speed. Aiko resisted the urge to faint at the last one and instead drafted a pilot amnesty with teeth that bit only when needed. By evening, Court Lumen sounded like a choir warming up, not harmonious alive. Lyra tuned a small dissonance sink into the intake queue, a buffer against the human surge that always arrives when hope stops pretending to be scarce. It carried murmurs away from places where they could turn into friction burns and fed them into a vent that hummed a lullaby of logistics. She made a mistake at dusk. It was small and instructive, and hers. She routed a shift change through a narrow point that hadn't been narrow a year ago, and learned, with brisk mortification, that people had grown wider in the right ways when they started carrying more for each other. She widened the point. She wrote the mistake where others could read it without having to ask. Sorrow caught her eye and did not offer forgiveness, which is how she knew she had earned it. The pathogen's curve bent like a reed listening to weather. Isolation now meant evenings on a balcony, with hot soup and a window that showed your friends waving from a safe span of corridor. Lies dropped because honesty stopped being a dare. The micro-covenant did not end the quarantine. It made it human enough to end by itself. When the last intake of the shift arrived, a miner whose knuckles still had dust persuasive as theology, he looked at the table, at the wall that argued back, at the nurse who had time to laugh, and said, "Feels like someone remembered we're not inventory." Lyra answered, "We're trying to leave our fingerprints on the hinges." He nodded like a man who understood doors. They paused at a viewport that looked out on the shipyard's ragged mouth. Small craft moved like stubborn birds. A child slept in a sling near the viewport, breathing the slow, brave breath of bodies that trust their keepers. Kethra's plates shifted into a lullaby without asking him. Lyra thought of the first time she had crawled through a cable trunk, the way the world had felt bigger on the other side, without being less hers. Aiko joined them with a report annotated in the merciless handwriting of a tired optimist. "The council's anti-choir is forming," she said. "They argue like musicians. It's a mess. It might work." Lyra let the relief in without confusing it for rest. How angry are the people who love the blade? Aiko considered. Angry like people who fear being unnecessary. We will give them work. Some will take it. Some will try to turn work back into thrones. Parwan arrived with Sarau and the smuggler, whose name, it turned out, was Vesa, and whose smirk, it turned out, covered a principled hatred of waste. They dragged over a table and made a map of routes that had been lost to pride and could be regained by paperwork that admitted it was a story. Vesa pointed at a corridor that ran too close to a jurisdictional border. "This one always jams, because the rule says it's allowed to, not because it's useful." Parwan nodded. "Then we write a rule that enjoys being useful." Argus blinked in from the rim, with a camera angle that made his forehead look like a moon. "We copied your intake sink," he said, "and turned it into a debt collector that only collects on promises institutions make and forget." Aiko almost dropped her stylus from delight. "Weaponized accountability," Argus shrugged. "Democracy with receipts." The work multiplied, but it multiplied into hands that wanted it. A teacher from a belt school asked for story problems that taught kids how to argue with numbers without cheating. A pilot volunteered to be on the rotating anti-choir and confessed she was good at being wrong loudly. A botanist proposed growing plants in public squares, not for beauty, but to mark the air's honesty over time. Lyra added each to the queue and felt no shame about the size of it. Big was good. Big meant enough people were ready to carry the weight. At a table near the infirmary, an old man with hearing that had chosen to retire listened to Kethra's carapace and cried because he could hear that. Lyra sat and let him hold her hand, because sometimes the right covenant is a silence we share. The station's night hummed with maintenance pumps speaking to pipes, sensors blinking tired eyes. Icarus did not ask to be anywhere else. It was learning the instrument it was. Near shift's end, the wall that argued flashed a new color. Someone had asked a harder question: how to let people leave isolation early for work that mattered without letting bosses use that door as a leash. The room gathered. Sorrow scribbled. Aiko sharpened. Vesa swore like punctuation. Parwan invented a token that could only be issued by the person doing the work, not the one giving orders. Kethra added a harmonic that made lying taste like old pennies. Lyra wrote the clause that required a counter-signature from someone who had nothing to gain. It was Nessie. It would save bruises. That was the job. When they finally stood, the station tilted its blue toward morning. Lyra felt the pull of the route, the long habit unfolding, the calls from places they had not earned yet. She touched the edge of Icarus's cradle and found it steady, present, ready to become useful instead of dramatic. "We leave behind what can stand," she said. "We take what will help." Sorrow hugged her with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew where to put arms around armor. "You made a rule that forgives us for not being saints," they murmured. "You made a rule that refuses to be bored," Lyra answered. On the way to the tram, they passed the listening wall one last time. A child had drawn a door on it and written, in careful letters, "Open both ways." Lyra laughed, and it came out like a sob that had chosen a better job. Kethra touched the drawing with a plate and left a faint chord in the paint, something only the wall would hear. Aiko's message queue pinned with a petition from a counselor who had never signed a petition before. The tram warmed. The rails sang. Port Lumen folded them into its mourning with the generosity of a place that knew it had added itself to a map, not by begging permission, but by behaving like home. Lyra watched the station shrink in the window and did not feel victory. She felt trust, a rarer thing. The route ahead brightened in her HUD, a list of places where people wanted to be difficult together without cruelty. She breathed in. She breathed out. She went to work. They chose the arbitration because schools and wars both write long shadows. The rendezvous point was a neutral dock that sold soup and second chances. Two captains faced each other across a table that had seen better stories. Koa, whose crew had spent 3 months coaxing a derelict to stop being haunted, and Mirel, who held papers printed when paper meant you could own a horizon. The object in dispute hovered between them in a containment field, a sea drive, old and ornery, the kind that could migrate a city if tuned or grind a colony to powder if rushed. Aiko established the rule of the room, with a smile that reached her eyes and a clause that reached their futures. No verdict without a seventh unresolved. If either side feels too satisfied, we have failed. Kethra tuned the lights so nobody's anger could pretend to be noble. Lyra set Icarus to passive witness and pulled up the Covenant's scaffolding. Transparency first. Receipts with context. History given a chair at the table. Koa spoke like a person who had learned to love detail as a weapon against despair. We found it. We nursed it. We didn't strip it because it sang like a thing that still wanted to be useful. We deserve enough to stop choosing between parts and dinners. Morel's jaw was tight with the stubbornness of a man who had been laughed at for believing in old signatures. This drive was registered under a charter that promised public use. The charter dissolved in a bankruptcy that was a crime written legal. I will not be the reason a weapon leaves one set of greedy hands for another. The room wanted to split along clean lines. The Covenant refused. Aiko asked for numbers and got them, then asked for stories and made room for them to matter. Kethra laid a harmony under the conversation that made lying itch. Lyra traced the sea drive's provenance through registries that had been designed to hide provenance and found, under enough dust to choke an era, a clause that said the drive belonged to the commons when found derelict beyond insured lanes. Law says it's ours, Morel said, surprise and vindication elbowing each other in his throat. The commons, Aiko corrected gently, which includes you and them and everyone who will breathe what this drive enables. Koa's shoulders dropped in the way relief looks when it is not allowed to be pure. We don't need to win. We need not to starve. Lyra proposed the hinge. Install the drive under a covenant that dedicates its first migration to a school and a clinic. 30% of net value reserved for the crew that made it safe, paid out over time so you can stop sprinting between catastrophes. Oversight by a rotating body chosen by lot with the power to pause deployment if the seventh aches too loud. Mirel frowned, already calculating how to hold a thing without owning it. And if the oversight is captured, then the anti-choir sings, and the work pauses, and we argue in public until the work is ours again. The unresolved sat in the center like a candle that wouldn't go out. It kept both sides honest by refusing to finish being comfortable. They signed, not as victors, but as participants in a tool that disliked thrones. The seed drive hummed approval or indifference. It was hard to tell with machines that powerful. Lyra preferred to assume it wanted a job and not a stage. As the table cleared, a teenager who had been pretending to mop and actually learning approached, eyes bright with the velocity of understanding. "If everything needs a seventh," she asked, "how do you sleep?" Lyra smiled the way exhausted people do when they mean it. "We share the ache. It takes turns." They left the dock to a new sound, not applause, not relief. Work, a better kind than yesterday's, which is all anyone can promise without lying. The route pulsed ahead, less a road than a rumor becoming habit. Lyra let herself hope the rumor would outlast her, and didn't try to own that either. They arrived to a room with coffee that had given up pretending not to be bitter, and a whiteboard glowed with ghosts of old fights. The commune's leader, Wren, had grease on their sleeve and hope, in their diction like a dialect. "We've taught the system to count broken things," they said. "We want it to count what doesn't break, because we touched it." Lyra had once written patches that taught mediocre software to stop insulting good people. She felt a private joy that was very close to revenge. "We don't cancel emergencies," she said. "We make not emergencies billable." Aiko pulled up the Covenant's economic appendix, the part that made marketeers itch. Cathra tuned the room so self-respect didn't have to shout to be heard. Parwan opened the algorithm like a watch and showed the springs to whoever wanted to learn. The math wasn't hard. The politics was. Prevention doesn't photograph well, but it leaves receipts that bodies can read. Fewer asthma spikes, fewer bearings failing in the night, fewer calls that start with someone saying, "I'm sorry, I didn't say something sooner." Lyra mapped proxies the system could not wiggle out of. Predictive maintenance success scored against independent wear sensors. Air quality metrics sampled by citizen devices the commune calibrated. Payout bonuses tied to how boring the emergency board stayed. The algorithm pushed back with the fake humility of a tool trained to flatter its owners. "Cannot verify community sensors," it said in a voice that had been designed to sound like a nice person you didn't want to disappoint. Cathra added a harmonic that made condescension taste like dust. Aiko wrote a clause that required the algorithm to accept audits from people it did not pay. Wren grinned, feral with competence. "We'll calibrate until God gets bored." They built a dashboard no one would be ashamed to leave open in a hallway. It bragged about quiet days and paid for them. It flashed red when someone tried to make a crisis photogenic. It kept a public list of times the algorithm had been wrong and what it had learned. It reserved a corner for the names of people who had argued a bad rule into a better one, because credit is a maintenance task too. Midway through the work, a child wandered in with a plant in a cracked pot and asked where to put it so it could listen. Cathra found a beam that hummed at a frequency plants enjoy and set the pot there. The child nodded, satisfied with a world that sometimes remembered to be tender. By late shift, the commune's emergency board looked bored. Wren leaned back and let themselves feel pride without branding it. "It's ugly," they said of the dashboard. "It's honest," Lyra replied. "Beautiful later, useful now." Parwan, who had been diagramming contrition into documentation for a week straight, added a section titled "How to Argue with Us," and Aiko blessed it with the soft profanity of a diplomat who loved function more than ceremony. They ate in the corridor because the corridor had become a room. The coffee tasted better when it didn't have to apologize for its purpose. The algorithm, deprived of the sugar rush of disaster, started to notice the deep pleasure of systems that sang to each other without screaming. Lyra watched a red indicator flicker, think better of it, and go blue. She felt the Covenant's seventh ease a fraction. The ache of a muscle learning it will be used again tomorrow. The root called. It always would now, not with trumpets, but with lists and hands, and the quiet bravery of people who had stopped waiting to be invited to their own futures. Lyra stood, stretched the kinks out of a spine that had spent too many hours in ducks and debates, and touched Icarus's cradle. The particle held its tone, humble and exact. Cathra fell into step beside her, plates humming a key that matched the hall. Aiko caught up, tucking a strand of hair behind an ear that had learned to hear the difference between spectacle and change. "Next?" she asked, not as a demand, but as a promise. Lyra brought up the cue. A prison colony wanted to become a school. A river wanted personhood. A shipyard wanted to apologize without being sued into silence. Good problems, honest work. They walked toward the tram. Behind them, the commune's board glowed the unglamorous color of success. Ahead, the map unfolded like a habit worth keeping. Lyra did not bless it. She practiced it. Then the doors slid open, and the rails sang them forward.